I must emphasize that the Philippines attaches great importance to this bilateral relationship with Indonesia, which will reach 77 years this year. Indonesia is not just the Philippines' close neighbor, it has long been a valued partner, friend, and brother.
While the world watches flashpoints, missile tests, naval standoffs, sanctions wars, the meetings that quietly reshape regional order rarely make the front page. On April 23, 2026, in Jakarta, one of those meetings took place. Indonesian Foreign Minister Sugiono and Philippine Foreign Affairs Secretary Teresa P.
I must emphasize that the Philippines attaches great importance to this bilateral relationship with Indonesia, which will reach 77 years this year. Indonesia is not just the Philippines' close neighbor, it has long been a valued partner, friend, and brother.
Lazaro sat across from each other at the 8th Indonesia-Philippines Joint Commission for Bilateral Cooperation and agreed to go deeper on economics, on security, on the future of their shared waters. No alliance was declared. No military pact was signed. But in today's Indo-Pacific, where sea lanes are contested, critical minerals are gaining value, and the global order is slowly shifting, this kind of quiet cooperation may ultimately matter more than dramatic summit meetings. These are two archipelagic nations bound by geography and by history. They share the same maritime spaces, they sit on some of the world's largest nickel reserves. Their fishermen sail the same seas, and their economic futures are increasingly tied to the same supply chains. What is now taking shape between them is not dramatic, but it is deliberate. It is the slow, careful construction of a partnership designed not for headlines, but for durability. Let us discuss this in detail. The most consequential decisions in geopolitics are rarely the loudest ones. Jakarta, April 23, 2026. Two foreign ministers, one conference table, and an agenda that covered everything from digital payments to naval patrols. On the surface, the 8th Indonesia-Philippines Joint Commission for Bilateral Cooperation looked like routine diplomacy.
Today's JCBC demonstrates that Indonesia-Philippines relations continue to grow stronger and more strategic. Our strength lies in our unity, and Indonesia and the Philippines will continue to move forward together.
Indonesian Foreign Minister Sugiono and Philippine Foreign Affairs Secretary Teresa P. Lazaro met at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, working through a bilateral framework that has been running since 1995. No cameras chased them down the steps. No breaking news alerts followed. But the timing of this meeting tells a different story. It did not happen in a vacuum. It happened while Chinese vessels were once again operating near Philippine-controlled Second Thomas Shoal, a rusting warship deliberately grounded on a reef that has become the most visible symbol of Beijing's slow-motion maritime pressure campaign. It happened while Indonesia was maintaining reinforced patrols around the Natuna waters, where Chinese fishing fleets had repeatedly pushed into its exclusive economic zone in previous years. Both nations were feeling the same pressure, from the same direction. Jakarta and Manila were not sitting down to build a military alliance. That is not how Southeast Asian diplomacy works. What they were building is something quieter, and in many ways more durable, mutual maritime insurance. A relationship designed to make both countries harder to isolate, harder to pressure, and harder to ignore. The ground beneath this partnership is literally valuable. Indonesia produces over 50% of the world's nickel supply. The Philippines sits among the top 5 nickel exporters globally. Nickel is not just a metal, it is the backbone of electric vehicle batteries, energy storage systems, and an expanding range of defense electronics. As the world races toward an energy transition, the countries that control nickel supply chains control a critical lever of the global industrial economy. Western and Chinese companies are both scrambling to lock in supply. What Jakarta and Manila are now beginning to explore, coordinated mineral policy, could give them real pricing power and real negotiating leverage, not just as individual exporters, but as a combined force. In the emerging competition over who controls the raw materials of the clean energy future, these two nations sitting across a table in Jakarta may have more cards than most people realize.
Our meeting today reflects the strong partnership between Indonesia and the Philippines as close neighbors, fellow archipelagic countries, and as well as founding members of ASEAN.
When Foreign Minister Sugiono spoke at the joint press statement, he was direct. The goal of this bilateral cooperation is tangible benefit for ordinary people. That grounding matters, because the economic agreements reached at this JCBC had real structural weight. The two governments agreed to deepen local currency settlement mechanisms, moving bilateral trade further away from dollar dependency. Indonesia has already walked this road with Malaysia and Thailand, where local currency frameworks produced faster settlement times, lower transaction costs, and improved trade flows for small and medium businesses. Bringing the Philippines into this system is the next logical step, and a meaningful one, in an era where the US dollar is increasingly weaponized through sanctions and financial exclusion. ASEAN states that can settle trade in their own currencies gain, in simple words, that quietly strengthens their strategic autonomy. Alongside this, both nations agreed to harmonize cross-border QR payment systems, which will make tourism easier, retail trade smoother, and micro-enterprises participants in a genuinely regional economy rather than bystanders to it. Then there is nickel. Indonesia and the Philippines together represent a dominant share of global nickel supply, the mineral that sits at the heart of EV battery manufacturing, energy storage, and defense electronics. Indonesia has already demonstrated how to convert raw resource wealth into industrial leverage. Its ban on unprocessed nickel exports forced a wave of downstream investment, building out smelters and battery manufacturing capacity at home. A coordinated approach between Jakarta and Manila could replicate and expand that logic, stabilizing global nickel markets, shaping pricing, and positioning the two countries as important partners for any multinational company trying to build a supply chain outside China's orbit. For Indonesia and the Philippines, the ocean is not a border, it is the country. Every major security threat, every trade route, every resource dispute runs through water. So, when both governments agreed to deepen maritime security cooperation, covering anti-smuggling, anti-piracy, fisheries enforcement, and maritime domain awareness, they were reinforcing the architecture that keeps their sovereign spaces intact. Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines have previously run joint patrols in the Sulu-Sulawesi seas, and the results were concrete. Piracy incidents declined significantly, and intelligence sharing between the three navies improved in ways that outlasted the patrols themselves. What Jakarta and Manila agreed to builds on exactly that experience. Alongside the security work, both governments also focused on border connectivity, specifically the cities of Manado, Bitung, Davao, and General Santos. These are the natural entry and exit points of the Mindanao-Sulawesi corridor, the sea route that connects eastern Indonesia to the southern Philippines. Indonesia has already invested heavily in Bitung as a regional hub port. Connecting that to Philippine ports at Davao and General Santos turns a historically quiet maritime lane into a working regional trade corridor. Of all the dimensions discussed at the Jakarta JCBC, this one is strategically important. The Philippines has been watching Indonesian defense manufacturing with growing interest, and for good reason. Indonesia's PT PAL shipyards have built and exported naval vessels across Southeast Asia, including landing platform docks and offshore patrol vessels, at price points and delivery timelines that Western suppliers rarely match. For Manila, procuring Indonesian-built platforms is a good budget decision. Regional defense procurement creates supply reliability, operational compatibility, and a form of strategic autonomy that dependence on distant suppliers cannot. Running alongside this is the quieter but equally important issue of continental shelf delimitation, the ongoing negotiation over overlapping maritime claims under international law. The 2014 Indonesia-Philippines EEZ agreement showed what is possible. When boundaries are clearly drawn, maritime law enforcement improves, resource disputes shrink, and the gray zones that generate friction disappear. Every nautical mile of clearly delimited shelf between these two nations is one less fault line available for exploitation. Both Indonesia and the Philippines believe in law over force, and that shared belief is not incidental. It is strategic.
The new government here in Manila is grappling with what might be called catastrophic success. What comes next is obviously going to be a delicate balancing act. It is a time for cool heads.
In 2016, an international arbitral tribunal ruled overwhelmingly in favor of the Philippines, finding that major elements of China's South China Sea claim, including its 9-dash line and land reclamation activities, were unlawful under international law. China rejected the ruling and has ignored it ever since. But Manila has not abandoned it. Under President Marcos, the Philippines has become more active in patrolling its waters and more aggressive in rallying international support for the ruling, more than tripling the number of governments publicly calling on Beijing to comply. Indonesia, meanwhile, has consistently upheld UNCLOS as the legal framework governing its own maritime claims around the Natuna waters. When these two states sit together and reaffirm international maritime law, they are not reciting diplomatic boilerplate. They are staking out a shared legal position, one that gives smaller and middle powers a tool to resist coercion that does not require matching China ship for ship. Alongside this, both governments address the human side of their bilateral relationship, the registration and legal documentation of persons of Filipino descent living in Indonesia. These are families, workers, and communities who have lived across this maritime border for generations. Getting their legal status right is quiet governance work, but it matters. It reduces stateless populations, improves labor protections, and builds the kind of people-to-people foundation that makes diplomatic partnerships resilient over time. The two ministers also stepped back from their bilateral agenda to speak about the wider world, and what they said reflected a coherent strategic worldview. On Myanmar, both governments emphasized the need for an inclusive political process to support long-term peace and regional stability. On the Middle East, Foreign Minister Sugiono stressed that Gulf stability is essential because any disruption there flows directly into ASEAN energy security, supply chains, and economic resilience. And both ministers affirmed that lasting peace requires justice for Palestine and a two-state solution. These are not random positions. They reflect the perspective of two nations that are deeply exposed to global instability, dependent on Gulf energy, reliant on open sea lanes, and invested in an ASEAN that remains coherent and relevant. When Jakarta and Manila speak in alignment on Myanmar, on the Middle East, and on the South China Sea, they are doing something important, demonstrating that ASEAN's two largest archipelagic states share not just geography, but a common reading of how the world works and what it needs. The Indonesia-Philippines partnership reaches far beyond two neighbors tightening ties. These two states straddle the most critical sea routes in Southeast Asia, hold more combined nickel supply than any other pair of nations on Earth, and anchor the maritime geography separating the Indian and Pacific Oceans. At the JCBC, Indonesia made its position clear. Jakarta welcomes the Nickel Alliance and intends to use it to build a resilient global supply chain. Philippine and Indonesian nickel industry bodies have already signed a formal partnership, building a regional supply chain corridor anchored in ASEAN-owned minerals development framework. Western and Chinese companies are racing to lock in battery material supply before the EV market matures. And Jakarta and Manila are not waiting to be courted. They are positioning themselves as the architects of a regional industrial axis that others will need to negotiate with. On the security side, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam now run the most operationally grounded security coordination in ASEAN, daily Coast Guard cooperation that keeps expanding in scope and depth. Over the next decade, watch for the quiet indicators that signal this partnership is maturing. Joint patrols expanding in frequency, maritime surveillance networks merging across the two archipelagos, Philippine armed forces operating Indonesian-built platforms. From Davao to Manado, and nickel processing corridors turning raw resource wealth into genuine industrial power. None of this will make breaking news. That is exactly the point. Indonesia and the Philippines are not building a military alliance for cameras, they are building something more valuable. A functional strategic partnership designed to survive shifting great power dynamics, outlast electoral cycles, and deepen regardless of who sits in Washington or Beijing. They control the sea lanes. They hold the minerals. They share the waters. And meeting by meeting, agreement by agreement, they are turning that shared geography into shared power.